You knew it had to happen. Welcome to the COM 300 module on gender criticism. Our objectives today are to examine gender, gender representations, and gender identity as critical concepts that provide multiple different frameworks of analysis. Second, to explore the stages of feminism and the assumptions that underlie feminist criticism as a subset of gender criticism. And third, to apply these critical concepts and questions to specific gendered representations in public communication media. The working vocabulary is available as kind of a double check on studying. What's gender studies and what's gender criticism? Well, gender studies includes women's studies, often termed from a feminist perspective. It also includes men's studies and LGBTQ studies. So it draws from many different disciplines. It's criticism, gender criticism, is an analysis of how gender, whether male, female, or many of the variations that are not strictly male or female, are framed in public messages, and how that framing has implications for power and for tolerance and for equity. The stages of the feminist movement, where a lot of this dissatisfaction with society's perspectives on gender started basically in the first wave of feminism, the late 1700s and the early 1900s, where we got a lot of information about inequalities. The suffragettes fought for voting rights for many, many, many years, which were finally passed in 1920. It hasn't even been 100 years that the women have had the right to vote in this country. The second wave of feminism then, sort of in the late 60s and into the 70s, built on working conditions and having women's access and women's protections in the workplace. Kind of dovetailing with the civil rights movement. And then the third wave of feminism moves, which is sort of the 1990s to the present, has been moving away from the upper class, white, heterosexual women towards engaging marginalized women and women of color. So there's been a kind of a shift that way. The larger differences in approaching the studies of gender. FOSS has a lot of different, in fact, almost a confusing array of different possibilities for studying gender. And that's kind of interesting to read through and just kind of see, wow, there's so many different ways. Let's take two large kind of perspectives. The first is liberal feminism. This is where the focus is on equality and equal rights for women and men. So the issue is more, is there an equity between the genders? If we have maternity leave, do we have paternity leave? And is there equality in that sense? This is a minimalist perspective. It basically says there aren't that many differences between men and women. They should enjoy equal rights, okay? The ability to fight in combat. There should be equal access to that struggle and that part of serving in the military. Cultural feminism, as opposed to liberal feminism, says that women have certain things, certain values, certain characteristics, certain traits that are good for society and should be enhanced. So this is a maximalist perspective, saying there is the most difference between, the maximal difference between men and women, and that what women bring to the table, whether it be nurturing or whether it be cooperation or a collaborative approach, whatever the argument is, what women bring to the table then is important and should be valued. FOSS focuses on feminism. She doesn't say gender criticism, but she says it's more than just about women. She says that it's really about a system of domination, of which male-female is one part. And feminist scholars and feminist activism helps bring the light to those imbalances of power. So even if it's not strictly about male-female, she sees feminist criticism and feminist theory as a way into highlighting the conditions of inequality and abuse and so forth. So the three values that feminists are essentially advocating for are equality. There should be a level of respect across that's equal across different genders. Immanent value, which means it's not what you do that's valuable, it's yourself, that everyone has immanent value. So because a female might not work a job, does that make them less important in what they do? And so that idea is one of the key values. And then finally, self-determination, that women and everyone should have the right to kind of determine their own destiny, rather than having society say, sorry, no, anything past this door is not for you, right? Some of the different kinds of feminism, well, eco-feminists, the cultural feminists, the girly feminists, the power feminists, the transnational feminists. There's a lot of different feminists and a lot of different feminisms for that way. In analyzing the artifact, what are some of the strategies that Foss is talking about? And here, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at artifacts or identify in artifacts that provide a kind of a critical vocabulary. So let's talk about a few. One of them is, these are strategies that Foss offers for disrupting hegemonies and patriarchal structures. One is generating multiple perspectives. As soon as you say there's no one dominant, as soon as you say, look, this one way of viewing the world is not the only way, there's other ways of viewing the world, well, then that undermines any kind of a totalizing, dominant, masculine kind of perspective, because it's there's other ways of looking at it. So you can look at shots taken from different angles in videos. You can look at how sometimes repetition over time will build through bringing in different perspectives and so forth. Cultivating ambiguity. In the same way, between yes and no, there are in-between possibilities, right, which we all sort of intuitively get when we're trying to get something from our parents. But in those spaces between the extremes, then we get some interesting things that happen that provide space for rhetoric and for voices that are not otherwise necessarily represented in those kind of extreme places. Preventing narrative closure. Anytime you see an artifact that doesn't just stop on a happy ending, well, then it becomes one of those things that opens up interpretation rather than closing it down and saying, yes, everyone lived happily ever after. So you get some ambiguity in there that's being cultivated. Reframing. Obviously, if you take a different vantage point or a different pathway, or you resource where we are able to draw our energy from, or redefine something. So spinster isn't someone who is aged and unable to get a man. A spinster is someone who spins the web of life. Once we redefine that, it becomes less onerous as a negative connotation of the word. Enacting is where you embody the point that you are making. Barbara Jordan, as one of the first leaders giving the Democratic National address at the convention, embodying the fact that they have come so far in getting people of color into positions of power, being a living example of politics or of commitment or something like that. Embodiment can be particularly powerful, as it is with some particular types of discourse. And finally, juxtaposing incongruities. This provides a perspective by incongruity, seeing things, in sort of an oxymoronic. That's an odd way of looking at it. The example Foss gives is that an advertising campaign that sounds like it's talking about a sexual encounter, when really it's actually talking about voting and making a kind of a subtle point about the sort of the importance of voting, not being deterred from it. So visit this particular image, the Bon Ton Burlesquers, and we'll just mention a couple of things using that the vocabulary. The things that we're looking at are objectification, where particular body parts are emphasized or analyzed. Anything that reduces the view from a total person into a part of a person is going to be looking at, objectifying that person in some way. So trait generalization is another example of a vocabulary where women are generalized as nurturing, as bad drivers, as all of the kind of stereotypes that people get, and men likewise are seen as strong and problem solvers and cannot disclose feelings and so forth, right? So we have some trait generalizations that operate sometimes that cannot, of course, always be, some of them are hasty generalizations, right? Language bias, where used to be, for example, stewardess, and now we have flight attendant. So some of that is changing a little bit in the language, but there's also still, a bachelor, that's a positive connotation, someone who's eligible, versus a spinster, which is a negative connotation, someone who's old and lives with their cats or something. So, in some ways, I think language bias is still operating across many different areas. Binary hierarchical opposition. So what happens here is when you say we've got something male and female, and inevitably we end up putting it in a hierarchy. Say this is, strength is better than weakness. All right, we see that in the hierarchy. We might also say competition is better than collaboration, and that might put that in a binary hierarchical opposition. And many times that opposition is weak because of the hierarchy and also because of the binary opposition. Right, so there's some different problems there. And the final concept is the idea of role or identity. And many of the Disney movies, for example, identify the different roles that a woman should play. And you can see the evolution from, say, the Little Mermaid, who gives up her voice to get her prince, to someone like Mulan, who goes off to fight, but comes back and then gives that up to marry her sergeant. And then finally to someone like Brave, and the love isn't about the love of an opposite sex person. The love is something quite different, as in Frozen, right? The love of a sibling. So roles and identity are shifting over time, but you can see how that would have a powerful influence on young women. If we look at the Bon Ton Burlesquers, then we see that there is some objectification. We're emphasizing certain parts of her body. Not too bad, because we've got the whole body here. But of course, she's got an uplifted bustier, and she's got her long legs there pinching down, and so there's a little bit of objectification there. But I think obviously there's trait generalization, right? We see in this instance the body drunk men who are, lusting and are clearly under the control, if we talk about binary hierarchical opposition, under the control of the strings from her fingers. And you can even find language bias when you see bon ton, good time, burlesquers. So we get a sense of, what is the role of women? They are to provide a good time. That's what we see there as the title of the place. And roles and identity. In this instance, the woman is sort of in control of the sexual or the entertainment side of things, and the men have the money and the suits as well as the alcohol. So you can kind of see the roles and identity there. Okay. What elements are analyzed in Krause et al.'s Daddy's Roommate? This is a gender analysis of a children's book about having two men for parents. And so they look at the idea of middle class status is highlighted. They're dressing nicely. The colors are red, white, and blue, consistent as a theme. They talk about baseball. They have white collar jobs, right? So we're sort of middle class here. Traditional anchoring values there. Loving and familiar characters are highlighted. They do things together. They're socially well adjusted. The mother is very accepting of the arrangement. So these are very loving characters that are portrayed. Family values are clear. They're devoted to the young boy. They have male and female roles. They downplay the sexuality, right? Gay isn't mentioned until like page 24. And the son is very positively affected by these family values and the positive things. They also subvert the dominant hegemony, which is an us versus them. And we get now more of a we rather than a gay versus straight. We become more of a we. So interesting analysis there. On the advanced style article, Foss, she analyzes the ideology of aging women. And what are the rhetorical acts, and what are they challenging, and how? So post this. Watch this YouTube video, which is the Lucky Diet Coke. What would a gender critic say about this? Which of the critical concepts would you think are most relevant when we talk about this artifact? And then there's another YouTube video called Evolution. Some of you may have seen it. Dove's Campaign for True Beauty. Do you think that this critical effort, the Campaign for Real Beauty, can or has changed attitudes about women's beauty expectations? Wishing you a wonderful day. Have a great one.